My swim coach made us sign waivers, saying we'd never quit mid-practice, then kicked me off the team for pulling a drowning teammate out while he was on his phone. The moment I saw Leo's body go still at the bottom of the deep end, time didn't slow down like they say it does in movies. It accelerated. My lungs were already burning from the 200-meter butterfly I'd just finished. My arms felt like they'd been filled with cement, and Coach Raymond Blackwell was standing 6 feet from the pool edge with his phone pressed to his ear, laughing at something the person on the other end was saying. I screamed his name. He didn't hear me, or he didn't care to hear me, because he turned his back to the pool and kept talking. Leo had been underwater for maybe 15 seconds by then, but when someone stops moving at the bottom of a 12-foot pool, every second feels like a countdown to something irreversible. I didn't think about the waiver I'd signed 3 months earlier, the one that said I'd complete every practice in full or face immediate dismissal from the varsity squad. I didn't think about the state championship that was 6 weeks away, or the college scouts who'd started showing up to our meets. I thought about the way Leo's arms had stopped churning, the way his body had become something that looked less like a person and more like a shadow. I dove in before my brain could finish processing what my eyes were seeing. And that decision, made in less than 2 seconds, would cost me everything I'd spent 4 years building. I'd been swimming competitively since I was 8 years old, back when my biggest concern was whether my goggles left red marks around my eyes that would still be visible during class photos. By the time I hit Westbrook High as a freshman, I was already posting times that made the varsity coach take notice. Raymond Blackwell had built the Westbrook Sharks into a dynasty over his 19 years at the helm. 4 state championships, dozens of athletes who'd gone on to swim Division I, and a reputation that made parents from 3 counties over try to get their kids enrolled in our district. When he told me I had the potential to be one of the best swimmers he'd ever coached, I felt like I'd been handed a golden ticket. My parents were thrilled. My dad had swum in college before a shoulder injury ended his career, and watching me succeed felt like a second chance for him. My mom just wanted me happy, but she also wanted me to have options, and swimming scholarships meant options. Coach Blackwell seemed like the answer to every prayer my family had ever whispered over a dinner table. What we didn't know then, what none of us could have known, was that the man who smiled for booster club photos and shook hands with school board members had a very different face when the doors were closed and the parents went home. The waivers started my sophomore year, though I didn't think much of them at the time. Coach Blackwell called a team meeting on the first day of the fall season and explained that he was implementing a new policy designed to build mental toughness and accountability. Champions don't quit, he said, pacing in front of the bleachers like a general addressing his troops. Champions push through pain, through exhaustion, through doubt. If you're going to be a shark, you need to understand that the moment you decide to give up, you've already lost. He handed out a stack of papers, single-page documents with dense legal language that most of us didn't bother reading. The gist was simple. By signing, we agreed to complete every practice session in full, no exceptions, or we'd be removed from the team. It felt hardcore, sure, but we were teenagers who wanted to win state championships and impress college recruiters. We signed without hesitation. What none of us realized was that the waiver wasn't about mental toughness. It was about control. It was a way for Coach Blackwell to ensure that nobody could question his methods, his intensity, or the things that happened when the natatorium doors were locked and it was just him and a pool full of exhausted kids. The first red flag came 3 weeks into that season, during a Thursday evening practice that had already stretched past the 2-hour mark. One of the freshman swimmers, a kid named Daniel Okonkwo who'd transferred from a club team in Atlanta, started having what looked like an asthma attack during a particularly brutal set of 400-meter repeats. I was 2 lanes over and could hear him gasping, see his hands gripping the lane line like it was the only thing keeping him alive. Coach Blackwell noticed too. He walked to the edge of the pool, looked down at Daniel, and said, "You signed the paper, Okonkwo. Finish the set, or find another team." Daniel's face was turning colors I'd never seen on a human being before, but he somehow managed to push off the wall and keep going. Later, in the locker room, I found him sitting on a bench with his inhaler pressed to his lips, tears streaming down his cheeks. I asked him if he was okay. He looked at me with something I can only describe as defeated acceptance and said, "This is just how it is here, right?" I wanted to tell him it wasn't, that things would get better, that Coach Blackwell was just testing us. But even then, some part of me knew I'd be lying. Things weren't going to get better. They were going to get worse. By junior year, I'd learned to navigate Coach Blackwell's world by keeping my head down and my mouth shut. The swimmers who thrived on the team were the ones who didn't ask questions, didn't complain, and didn't show weakness. I watched kids get screamed at for missing splits by fractions of seconds. I watched a girl named Priya Sharma get called weak in front of the entire team because she asked to use the bathroom during a dry land session. I watched a senior named Marcus Whitfield get his scholarship recommendation letter torn up in front of him because he'd admitted to a recruiter that practices were intense. Wait, I need to correct that. It wasn't Marcus. It was a senior named Gabriel Whitfield. The mind plays tricks when you're trying to remember trauma, jumbling names and faces into a blur of fear and confusion. Gabriel never swam competitively again after that. He quit the team, quit the sport entirely, and I heard from mutual friends that he still flinches when he hears a whistle blow. Coach Blackwell called him a quitter. The rest of us called him lucky. The teammate I pulled from the bottom of the pool was Leo Nakamura, a junior like me who'd joined the team at the start of that year after his family moved from San Diego. Leo was one of those swimmers who made everything look effortless, all smooth strokes and perfect turns and times that dropped with every meet. He was also one of the few people on the team who hadn't lost himself to Coach Blackwell's system. He still smiled during warm-ups. He still made jokes in the locker room. He still treated swimming like something you did because you loved it, not because you were afraid of what would happen if you stopped. I liked Leo. More than that, I respected him, because he'd somehow figured out how to survive without surrendering his soul. What I didn't know, what nobody knew until much later, was that Leo had been dealing with something none of us could see. He'd been having episodes of sudden dizziness and disorientation, symptoms his doctor had been monitoring for months. He'd told Coach Blackwell about it at the start of the season, shown him the medical documentation, asked for minor accommodations during practice. Coach Blackwell had looked at the paperwork and told Leo that if he couldn't handle full practices, he shouldn't be on a competitive swim team. No accommodations, no modifications, swim or get out. The day everything fell apart was a Wednesday afternoon in early March, 6 weeks before the state championship meet that was supposed to be the culmination of everything I'd worked for. Practice had been running for nearly 3 hours by that point, which wasn't unusual. Coach Blackwell often extended sessions when he felt we weren't giving enough effort, and that day, he decided we needed additional conditioning work because our relay times had been sluggish at the previous weekend's invitational. I was in lane 4, Leo was in lane 6, and between us was a sophomore named Amara Collins who'd been fighting a stomach virus all week, but hadn't dared tell Coach for fear of being labeled soft. We were doing a set of 8 200-meter individual medleys on a tight interval, the kind of set that leaves your muscles screaming and your lungs begging for mercy. I'd just touched the wall after my 7th rep when I looked over and saw Leo push off for his final one. Something about the way he moved didn't look right. His stroke seemed uncoordinated, choppy, like his arms weren't getting the same signals from his brain. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself he was just tired. I told myself it would be fine. It wasn't fine. Leo made it through the butterfly and backstroke legs of the IM, but somewhere during the breaststroke, his movements started to slow. Not the gradual slowdown of exhaustion that all swimmers experience, but a sudden lurching deceleration that looked mechanical, like a robot running out of battery. By the time he reached the wall to push off for the freestyle leg, he was barely moving. I watched him turn, watched his feet find the wall, watched him push off into the deep end of the pool. And then I watched him stop. His body went horizontal for a moment, suspended in the crystalline blue like a photograph, and then he started to sink. I screamed. I screamed Coach Blackwell's name so loud that my throat felt like it was tearing. Amara heard me and stopped mid-stroke, looking around in confusion. Other swimmers paused at the walls, trying to figure out what was happening. But Coach Blackwell didn't move. He was standing at the far end of the pool deck, phone pressed to his ear, his back turned to us. Later, I would learn that he was on a call with a booster club parent discussing fundraising for new starting blocks. At that moment, all I knew was that Leo was sinking and the man who was supposed to be watching us wasn't watching anything at all. I dove in without thinking, without calculating, without considering the consequences. The water hit me like a wall of cold reality, and I swam toward Leo with everything I had left in my exhausted body. He'd sunk to the bottom by the time I reached him, 12 feet down in water that felt darker than it should have. His eyes were open but unfocused, staring at something I couldn't see. I grabbed him under the arms and kicked toward the surface, my lungs burning, my muscles screaming, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Breaking the surface felt like being reborn. I gasped for air and started dragging Leo toward the edge of the pool, where Amara and another swimmer named Isaiah Oyalaran had already climbed out and were reaching down to help pull him up. We got Leo onto the deck just as Coach Blackwell finally turned around and saw what was happening. The look on his face wasn't concern or fear or shock. It was annoyance, pure, unmistakable annoyance, like we'd interrupted something far more important than a kid nearly drowning in his pool. The next few minutes were chaos. Leo was conscious but disoriented, unable to answer basic questions about where he was or what had happened. Amara had already pulled out her phone and called 911, which later turned out to be a violation of Coach Blackwell's policy against having phones on deck. Isaiah was trying to keep Leo awake and talking. I was kneeling beside them, water dripping from my body, my hands shaking so badly I couldn't have held anything if I'd tried. And Coach Blackwell was standing over all of us, not helping, not calling for assistance, just standing there with his phone still in his hand and the expression that made my blood run cold. When the paramedics arrived 8 minutes later, they immediately suspected what Leo's doctors would later confirm. He'd experienced a cardiac arrhythmia that caused him to lose consciousness, almost certainly triggered by the extreme physical exertion of a 3-hour practice that he should never have been forced to complete. If I hadn't pulled him out when I did, if I'd waited even another 30 seconds, he might have drowned. The paramedics told me I'd saved his life. Coach Blackwell told me I'd violated my waiver by leaving the pool before practice was officially over. The conversation happened in his office while the ambulance was still in the parking lot, its lights painting red and white streaks across the natatorium windows. Coach Blackwell sat behind his desk, calm as a glacier, and informed me that by interrupting practice to pull Leo from the water, I had violated the terms of the agreement I'd signed at the beginning of the season. He reminded me that the waiver clearly stated all practice sessions must be completed in full without interruption. He told me that exceptions couldn't be made, no matter the circumstances, because doing so would undermine the culture of accountability he'd spent 2 decades building. I remember staring at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for him to laugh and tell me he was joking. He wasn't joking. He was completely serious. A kid had almost died in his pool while he was checking his phone, and his response was to punish the person who'd saved that kid's life. I told him he couldn't be serious. I told him this was insane. I told him I'd go to the athletic director, the principal, anyone who would listen. He smiled at me then, a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes, and said, "You can try, but I've been here 19 years, and you're just a kid who couldn't follow simple instructions. Who do you think they'll believe?" I went home that night feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under me. My parents could tell something was wrong the moment I walked through the door, still damp from the pool, my face carrying an expression I couldn't have named if I'd tried. I sat them down at the kitchen table and told them everything. Leo's collapse, my rescue, Coach Blackwell's phone call, the conversation in his office, the threat that hung in the air like a guillotine blade. My dad's face went through about 7 different emotions in the span of 30 seconds, finally settling on a kind of cold fury I'd never seen from him before. My mom started crying, which made me feel worse than anything Coach Blackwell had said. They asked me what I wanted to do. I told them I wanted to fight. I wanted to expose what was happening on that team, not just what had happened to me, but everything I'd witnessed over the past 3 years. The waivers, the intimidation, the kids who'd been broken by a system designed to crush anyone who showed weakness. My dad nodded slowly and said, "Then we fight, but we do it smart. We document everything, we get lawyers involved, and we make sure that when we go public, there's nothing he can say to worm his way out of this." It was the first moment since I'd pulled Leo from that pool that I felt something other than hopeless. The next morning, I woke up to a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was Coach Blackwell, using what I later learned was his personal cell phone, which he only gave out to select students and parents. The message was short. "Your removal from the team will be announced at today's practice. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Collect your gear and move on." I stared at that message for a long time, reading it over and over, trying to understand how a man could be so casual about destroying a teenager's life. Then I took a screenshot and sent it to my dad. He called back within minutes and told me he'd already reached out to a sports attorney named Patricia Reeves, who specialized in cases involving student-athlete rights. She'd agreed to meet with us that afternoon. I spent the hours between that call and the meeting compiling everything I could remember about my time on the Westbrook Sharks. Dates, incidents, names of witnesses, descriptions of what I'd seen and heard. By the time we sat down in Patricia's office, I had 17 pages of handwritten notes and a determination that felt like a physical force inside my chest. Patricia Reeves was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd spent 15 years taking on schools and coaches who thought they were untouchable. She had gray-streaked hair that she wore pulled back in a severe bun, reading glasses that she kept pushing up her nose, and a way of asking questions that made you feel like she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever answer you were going to give. She listened to my story without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and said, "This waiver he made you sign, do you still have a copy?" I did. My mom had insisted on keeping copies of everything I signed for school activities, a habit that had always seemed paranoid, but now felt like divine intervention. Patricia read through the document twice, then looked up at me with the first hint of a smile I'd seen from her. "This thing isn't worth the paper it's printed on. A minor can't sign away their right to respond to an emergency. A coach can't contractually obligate a student to ignore someone drowning. This is the legal equivalent of demanding that you pinky promise not to call 911 if the building catches fire." For the first time in 24 hours, I felt like I could breathe. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in how institutions protect their own. Coach Blackwell announced my removal from the team exactly as he'd promised, citing a violation of team policies without specifying what policy I'd supposedly violated. When my parents demanded a meeting with Principal Janet Cho, they were told she was unavailable and would get back to them when her schedule permitted. When my dad called the athletic director, a man named Franklin Brooks, who'd held the position for 12 years, he was given a runaround that would have been impressive if it weren't so infuriating. Mr. Brooks expressed sympathy for what had happened, but said that coaching decisions were at Coach Blackwell's discretion and that the school couldn't interfere with how he ran his program. He said this about a coach whose negligence had nearly killed a student, whose policies had traumatized dozens of kids, whose ego was so fragile that he'd rather destroy a teenager's future than admit he'd made a mistake. I started to understand why Gabriel Whitfield had walked away from swimming entirely. Fighting this system felt like trying to punch a cloud, but we had something that Coach Blackwell didn't expect: other victims who were finally willing to talk. Once word got out about what had happened to me, I started getting messages from current and former swimmers who had their own stories to share. Daniel Okonkwo, the freshman who'd nearly collapsed from an asthma attack, told me he still had nightmares about Coach Blackwell's voice telling him to finish the set. Priya Sharma sent me a 3-page email detailing every instance of verbal abuse she'd experienced during her 2 years on the team. A former swimmer named Joaquin Fernandez, who'd graduated 4 years earlier, reached out to say he'd been waiting for someone to finally take a stand against Coach Blackwell and would do whatever he could to help. By the end of those 2 weeks, Patricia Reeves had sworn statements from 14 people who'd experienced or witnessed Coach Blackwell's behavior. She told us it was time to escalate. She contacted the State High School Athletic Association, filed a formal complaint with the school board, and reached out to a journalist named Miranda Thorne at the regional newspaper who'd written extensively about misconduct in youth sports. The institutional response to Patricia's escalation was swift and predictable. The school district's legal counsel sent a letter advising us to drop our complaints and warning of potential defamation liability if we continued making accusations against Coach Blackwell. Principal Cho finally found time for a meeting, but spent most of it deflecting questions and emphasizing Coach Blackwell's contributions to the school's athletic program. Athletic Director Franklin Brooks suggested that perhaps I'd misunderstood the situation, that Coach Blackwell was under a lot of pressure with the state championship approaching, that maybe we could all just move past this unfortunate incident. Meanwhile, Coach Blackwell himself was telling parents and students that I'd been removed from the team for insubordination, and that any claims I was making were the bitter lies of a kid who couldn't handle discipline. The gaslighting was relentless, professional, and terrifyingly effective. I watched some of my former teammates, kids I'd trained beside for years, start to look at me differently, like I was the problem, like I was the one who'd done something wrong. It made me feel like I was losing my mind. The turning point came from an unexpected source: Leo Nakamura's medical records. After his cardiac episode at the pool, Leo's parents had demanded a full investigation into how their son had been allowed to complete a 3-hour practice despite documented medical conditions that should have exempted him from extended physical exertion. When they obtained Leo's school health file, they discovered that Coach Blackwell had received a letter from Leo's cardiologist at the start of the season explicitly stating that Leo should not participate in practices lasting more than 90 minutes without rest breaks. The letter had been signed for, date-stamped, and filed in Coach Blackwell's office. He'd read it, acknowledged it, and ignored it entirely. More than that, when Leo had asked for accommodations, Coach Blackwell had told him no such medical documentation existed. He'd lied directly to a student about records that could have prevented a medical emergency. When Leo's parents shared this information with Patricia Reeves, she nearly knocked her coffee cup off her desk reaching for the phone. This wasn't just negligence anymore. This was a paper trail proving willful endangerment, and it was exactly the kind of evidence that makes school districts suddenly very interested in cooperating. The school board called an emergency closed session 3 days later. My parents and I weren't allowed to attend, but Patricia was there representing our interests, along with attorneys for Leo's family and the district itself. I spent those 4 hours pacing my bedroom, checking my phone every 30 seconds, trying to convince myself that everything would work out while simultaneously preparing for the worst. When Patricia finally called, I could hear something in her voice I hadn't heard before. Satisfaction. She told us the board had seen the evidence, heard testimony from multiple victims, and reviewed Coach Blackwell's employment file, which apparently contained warnings from years past that had been quietly buried instead of acted upon. They'd voted unanimously to place him on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. It wasn't the complete victory I'd been hoping for, but it was a start. For the first time in weeks, I let myself believe that justice might actually be possible. The investigation that followed was more thorough than I dared to hope. The district hired an independent investigator named Dr. Wesley Okafor, a former athletic administrator with expertise in sports program oversight and a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when it came to uncovering misconduct. Over the course of 6 weeks, Dr. Okafor interviewed more than 40 current and former swimmers, coaches from other schools who'd interacted with the Westbrook program, medical professionals who'd treated injured athletes, and administrators who'd received complaints over the years. He obtained copies of the illegal waivers, compiled documentation of practice schedules that far exceeded recommended guidelines for high school athletes, and discovered a pattern of behavior that stretched back more than a decade. When his report was finally completed, it ran to over 200 pages. The executive summary alone was damning enough to end careers. It described Coach Blackwell as a coach whose emphasis on winning at all costs created an environment of psychological manipulation, physical endangerment, and systematic intimidation of minors. It recommended immediate termination and referral to law enforcement for potential criminal charges related to Leo's medical emergency. The school board accepted Dr. Okafor's recommendations in full during a public meeting that drew more people than I'd ever seen in the district administration building. Parents who'd spent years defending Coach Blackwell sat in silence as the findings were read aloud, their faces cycling through denial, shock, and something that looked almost like shame. Coach Blackwell himself wasn't present, having been advised by his own attorney to stay away, but his absence felt louder than any statement he could have made. When the board chair announced that Raymond Blackwell's employment with the Westbrook School District was terminated effective immediately, a murmur went through the crowd that sounded almost like a collective exhale. I was sitting between my parents in the third row, trying to process what I was hearing, when I felt my mom squeeze my hand so hard I thought she might break my fingers. I looked at her and saw tears streaming down her face. My dad had his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitching. None of us said anything. We didn't need to. 19 years of tyranny had finally ended, and we'd been part of the reason why. But the story didn't end with Coach Blackwell's firing. 3 weeks later, the district attorney's office announced that they were filing criminal charges related to Leo's medical emergency. The charges included reckless endangerment of a minor and falsification of medical records, the latter stemming from evidence that Coach Blackwell had told Leo no medical documentation existed when he knew full well that it did. The maximum penalty for both charges combined was 5 years in prison, though Patricia told us realistically he'd probably end up with probation and community service. It didn't matter. What mattered was that his name would be attached to criminal charges forever, that any future employer who ran a background check would see what he'd done, that the reputation he'd spent 19 years building would be permanently stained by his own choices. When the charges were announced, I got a text from Gabriel Whitfield, the senior whose scholarship letter had been torn up in front of him. It said simply, "Thank you. I didn't think anyone would ever make him pay." I saved that text and still look at it sometimes when I need to remember why fighting matters. Leo Nakamura recovered fully, though his doctors advised him to step back from competitive swimming to focus on managing his cardiac condition. When I visited him at his house a few weeks after everything went down, he thanked me for pulling him out of the pool and then apologized for everything I'd lost because of it. I told him he had nothing to apologize for, that I'd make the same choice 1,000 times over if I had to. He asked me if I missed swimming, if I regretted any of it. I thought about the question for a long time before answering. I told him that I missed the water, missed the feeling of cutting through it with perfect form, missed the camaraderie of teammates who understood what it meant to push your body past its limits. But I told him I didn't miss what swimming had become under Coach Blackwell, the fear and the silence and the constant pressure to pretend everything was fine when nothing was fine at all. I told him that losing my spot on the team had been devastating, but watching a corrupt system finally face consequences had given me something more valuable than any championship trophy could have. It had given me proof that sometimes the good guys actually win. The aftermath stretched out over the following months in ways I hadn't anticipated. Several families filed civil lawsuits against the district for failing to protect their children from Coach Blackwell's conduct, and while the details of the settlements were kept confidential, I heard through various sources that the numbers were significant enough to make the school board completely overhaul their athletic oversight policies. A new swim coach was hired, a woman named Destiny Abrams, who'd previously coached at a club program in Maryland and had a reputation for developing talent while actually caring about her athletes as human beings. Some of my former teammates reached out to apologize for doubting me, for believing Coach Blackwell's narrative, for not speaking up sooner when they'd seen the same things I had. I accepted their apologies without resentment, understanding that they'd been victims too, trapped in a system that punished anyone who questioned authority. The culture Coach Blackwell had created hadn't been their fault. It had been his, and now it was over. I ended up swimming again, though not for Westbrook High. A club team in the next town over offered me a spot after their coach saw my times from before everything happened, and I spent the remainder of my junior year and all of my senior year training with them instead. It wasn't the same as being on the varsity team I'd dreamed about since I was 8 years old, but it was better in ways that matter more than records or championships. Coach Destiny at my new club actually asked how we were feeling. She adjusted workouts when swimmers were injured or sick. She treated us like people instead of machines designed to generate results for her trophy case. The first time she stopped practice early because someone was clearly struggling, I nearly cried from the sheer relief of being in an environment where that was allowed. I realized then how much damage Coach Blackwell had done, not just to the kids he'd directly abused, but to our entire understanding of what sports leadership could look like. He'd made us believe that cruelty was normal, that suffering in silence was strength, that coaches who cared about your well-being were soft. He'd been wrong about all of it. The college recruiters who'd been interested in me before everything happened slowly started coming back around once word spread about what had really gone down at Westbrook. One of them, a coach from a Division II school in upstate New York, told me that what I'd done showed more character than any swim time ever could. She said her program valued athletes who would do the right thing even when it cost them something, and that she'd be honored to have me on her team. I committed to her school in the fall of my senior year, and as I'm writing this, I'm 3 weeks away from starting my freshman year of college as a scholarship swimmer. The path I took to get here wasn't the one I'd imagined, wasn't the straight line from high school star to D1 recruit that I'd planned out in my head since middle school. But maybe that's okay. Maybe the detours teach you things the straight paths never could. Maybe nearly losing everything is what helps you understand what actually matters. Sometimes I still think about that moment at the bottom of the pool, Leo's body suspended in the blue, Coach Blackwell's back turned, the choice I had to make in less than 2 seconds. I wonder what would have happened if I'd hesitated, if I'd waited for Coach to notice, if I'd let fear of consequences override my instinct to help. I know the answer, of course. Leo might have died. A family would have been destroyed. And Coach Blackwell would still be standing on that pool deck, phone in hand, training the next generation of swimmers to believe that their well-being mattered less than his win-loss record. I'm glad I dove in. I'm glad I broke the rules of a waiver that should never have existed. I'm glad I became the person who finally said enough, even when saying enough cost me everything I thought I wanted. Some prices are worth paying. Some fights are worth having. And some coaches need to learn that a piece of paper can't protect them from the consequences of their own cruelty. Coach Raymond Blackwell accepted a plea deal 6 months after he was charged. He pleaded guilty to reckless endangerment and received 2 years of probation, community service hours, and a permanent ban from coaching minors in any capacity in our state. The falsification charge was dropped as part of the deal, which frustrated some people but felt like justice enough to me. His coaching license was revoked, his name was added to a state registry of individuals prohibited from working with youth athletes, and the legacy he'd spent 19 years building crumbled into dust. Last I heard, he'd moved to another state and was working in insurance sales. I hope his new colleagues never have to learn what he's capable of. I hope the distance from a pool and a whistle has changed him somehow. But honestly, I don't think about him much anymore. He took up enough space in my head for 3 years. He doesn't deserve any more. Leo texts me every few weeks to check in, and we've become actual friends rather than just teammates bonded by trauma. He's doing well, managing his condition, planning to study medicine because he wants to be the kind of doctor who actually listens when patients tell them something is wrong. Daniel Okonkwo is thriving on the new Westbrook team under Coach Abrams, and I heard he's already posting times that have D1 programs taking notice. Priya Sharma transferred to a different school for her senior year, but told me recently that she started swimming again recreationally, just for fun, which is something she never thought she'd be able to do after what happened. The ripples of what we did together keep spreading outward, touching lives I'll never know about, changing systems I'll never see. That's the thing about standing up when everyone else stays silent. You never know how far the echo will carry. If you made it this far, hit like. You've earned it.